Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 18, Section 3, New Civil Rights Issues. So, number one, where did nearly 70% of African Americans live in 1965? And that was in large cities, primarily urban areas. Number two, what groups of people or businesses refuse to rent or sell to African Americans? And that would be real estate agents, local banks, and landlords. African Americans, for the most part, even if they had the income to move, in many cases had difficulties finding um, bankers or real estate agents that would help them find loans or even properties to buy outside of neighborhoods that were already predominantly urban um, neighborhoods that were settled primarily by blacks. Number three, how the gains of the civil rights movement contribute to frustrations of African Americans living in these urban areas. And many of them had their hopes raised that maybe there would be changes that would occur, but their everyday living conditions really didn't see a lot of improvement. And that made people frustrated. And with frustration comes the desire to get change. And sometimes that change comes in the form of demonstrations and riots. So, in number four, where did the worst riot in the 1960s occur, and what were some of the results? One of the worst riots took place in Detroit, Michigan. There were 43 deaths, over 1,000 wounded, 1,300 buildings were destroyed by fire. There was property losses that were estimated at thousands of dollars. Number five, what was the purpose of the Commission and what did it recommend? The Kerner Commission, for the most part, was set out to study the causes of urban riots, and its recommendations included the fact that we needed to see more jobs created in urban areas, we needed more public housing units, we needed a renewed federal commitment to fight de facto segregation. Just so you understand, Detroit wasn't the only place that saw a large number of riots. You saw rioting happening in places like Los Angeles, like the Watts riot, but even closer to home, cities like Omaha suffered riots as well. And throughout the United States, northern cities, southern cities alike, saw demonstrations taking place trying to fight these kind of issues. Number six, why did President Johnson never endorse the recommendations of the Kerner Commission? He believed that the federal government was already saddled by its spending for the Vietnam War. Yeah, we had our Great Society, we had our war on poverty, we spent a lot of money there. But with the war in Vietnam, that was a huge cash cow. And so it made it really difficult for Johnson to find extra funds, especially with the unpopularity of the Vietnam War. People were not wanting to spend the money to make these improvements from the Kerner Commission. Number seven, why did some African American leaders become critical of Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent strategy by the mid 1960s? And part of that was that it really did fail to improve their economic position. Who explained Black Power to basically mean controlling the social, political, and economic direction of the struggle for equality? And that was a man named Stokely Carmichael. Carmichael was one of the founders of SNCC, going back several years. But by the time we get to about the mid 1950s, he's growing very frustrated with the nonviolent, peaceful resistance. And in a way, it starts advocating a more direct approach, in some cases, sometimes a more violent approach. One of the more famous uh, kind of signs of demonstration actually occurred at the 1968 Summer Olympics with two of our medalists, Tommy Smith and John Carlos. These were medalists in the 200-meter dash. Um, and one of the things that they did is, as they were given their medals, uh, when the Star Spangled Banner starts being played, rather than putting the hands over the hearts, they lift their fist, their gloved fist, into the air. as a sign of protest and demonstration. Maybe not unlike some of the demonstrations that we've seen even in today's times with the NFL and such. But certainly there were many people back home that were very disturbed by what they saw and ranted and protested about this. But needless to say, this was a demonstration of Black power during the late 1960s. What organization was led by Elijah Muhammad, and that was an organization known as the Nation of Islam. And one of the more vocal leaders of the Nation of Islam was a guy named Malcolm X, or if you were from Omaha, Nebraska, you might remember him as Malcolm Little. Malcolm X was born in Omaha, raised elsewhere, um, found himself in trouble with the law, eventually went to prison, was introduced to the Nation of Islam while in jail, changed his name to Malcolm X, and became one of the more vocal leaders of the Nation of Islam. So, why did Malcolm X conclude that an integrated society was possible? Well, at some point in time, he actually goes on his Hajj to Mecca, and while he's on his Hajj, he comes in contact with a lot of other Muslims, Muslims that come from a variety of different races that were all worshiping together. And rather than taking a kind of a more violent tone that he did with when he was kind of the spokesman for the Nation of Islam, when he returns from the Hajj, he kind of has had an enlightenment, and he sees really Islam as a more peaceful religion. And because of that, he finds himself at odds with the Nation of Islam. And eventually, he is going to be assassinated by other members of the Nation of Islam. Number 11, what was one of the Black Panthers' main beliefs? And the Black Panthers, for the most part, called for violence, but revolution in the U.S. if it was necessary. Um, Many members of the Black Panthers really were members of the Black Power movement that kind of morphed into this militant group. The photo that you see below are depicting an event that took place in California at the state capitol, where members of the Nation of Islam, or not members of the Nation of Islam, but the Black Panthers gathered. So, what did the Black Panthers 10-point program call for? It called for an end of racial oppression and community control of major institutions, such as their schools. They wanted control of housing, law enforcement, and their hospitals. Number 13, how had the civil rights movement changed by the late 1960s? For the most part, it had become a little more fragmented, and there were a lot of different competing organizations that had been kind of grown out of this movement. Number 14, what happened as a result of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.? Dr. King was assassinated in April of 1963 when he was in Memphis, helping organize a strike of sanitation workers. And he was gunned down at the Lorraine Motel by a guy named James Earl Ray. As a result of his assassination, there was nationwide mourning, but uh, probably a little bit scarier was the issue of riots that broke out in over 1,000 cities, including Omaha, Nebraska, as well. And number 15, what was the key element of the Civil Rights Act of 1968? Fair housing was part of this. It also outlawed discrimination in housing sales and rentals. Thank you very much.